Good afternoon, everybody. I think we are going to get started with our afternoon session. My name is Tracy Hemmeter. I'm with the Santa Clara Valley Water District. We have a lovely panel here to talk about how we're going to build the water plan from the bottom up, or pardon me, building the next update of the water plan from the local regional level. Bottom up's probably a little bit easier to remember. I'm going to mention we have a substitute panelist. The bios are all in your package except Dana Freehoff from the San Diego County Water Authority is subbing for Mark Stadler. She has about 30 years of experience working on water supply planning and policy issues with the authority, and if you want more information, I'll be happy to share it. It's right here. When I was talking to Dana yesterday about the panel, she said, well, I think we can all agree that building the water plan from the regional level up is a great idea, so what are we all going to say? So I was thinking about that last night. I don't know if it was 8 or 9 or 10 that I sent the email, but everybody responded. So I'm going to ask the people, first we're going to have an introduction from Mike Floyd. Sorry, Mike, I almost forgot you. We're going to have some introduction from Mike Floyd about what we mean about building the water plan from the bottom up. And then our panelists are going to speak from their perspectives as regions, as participants in multiple IRW regions, multiple hydrologic regions, from statewide perspectives, from tribal communities, and how do we make sure that everybody is represented in the process. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Floyd to give you a very brief, he promised, presentation.
Thank you, Tracy. Yes, and I promise to keep it short. I'm just going to give you a few slides to set up this conversation, and then I'm going to get out of the way, and I'm going to hear, we're all here to hear some great suggestions. I think this concept from building the water plan, the 2023 update from the bottom up, is a great one, but actually doing it, there will be certain challenges in doing that, and that's why we've got these great folks here with us today. So with that, let's get into it. So there's this concept of the Integrated Regional Water Management Atlas that was introduced when we were developing this document. This is called Stakeholder Perspectives, and I'll just do shorthand here for the future of IRWM. This was a multi-year project where we engaged stakeholders across the state and collected views, opinions, and a lot of other kinds of input related to how do we sustain IRWM and strengthen it at the same time, and how do we do it in the future. So during that process, we received a lot of input related to this water management atlas concept. That's basically to define who the regions are, where they are, what do they do, what are their goals, needs, and priorities. So the idea for the atlas comes from stakeholders, IRWM practitioners, and stakeholders, and it's outlined on document. So here it is. One of the 70 actions that's outlined in the stakeholders document is to publish and maintain a web-based IRWM Atlas that summarizes the makeup of IRWM regions across the state and water management challenges and successes. So we're about to get going on that. So we offered an initial concept for doing that a few years ago, just as on a trial basis, and we focused on John Woodling's area, the American River Basin, and the concept was we digest the information that's contained in the IRWM plan and make it in kind of a bite-sized chunk and do that for all the regions across California. Unfortunately, we weren't able to continue that concept because of funding issues, but we're back at it now. So we're going to try a relaunch here pretty soon. And our initial concept for the content of the Atlas summaries would be, characteristics of the region, what the regional water management group is, who is involved, and then key water management needs and challenges, and then you can see the other list. Basically, the IRWM region in a nutshell. So from there, now we're going to be talking about rolling up that information, regional level information, up to a higher level. Where does this come from? I'm going to go back to the stakeholders document again, and by the way, there's some copies on the table on the outside if you'd like a copy and haven't seen it yet. But anyway, we were asked, or stakeholders said, we need to better align DWR programs to support IRWM to the extent possible. And one of those alignment issues is the California Water Plan update. So the comment that you see down at the bottom of the screen here kind of paraphrases what we heard from folks and says, look, we spent all this time putting together IRWM plans, all this stakeholder effort, all this great information. Well, why the heck aren't you guys using it for the water plan? Okay, amen to that. Let's figure out a way to do that. That's why we're here today. So initial concept that we have is bringing together regional information. And you'll see on your screen, there's a little section of California. That happens to be the Central Coast hydrologic area. And it so we got some Central Coasters here. Anyway, our initial concept is maybe the next level that we roll up information from the IRWM region level, that next level could be a hydrologic area. And there's several of those, many of those across the state. That would be just one concept. It could be something different. That's something we want to engage stakeholders on and include in the conversation today. What's that next level up? How do we take the information that's developed through the IRWM process in individual regions and synthesize that next level up? Common themes, common needs, that kind of thing. So our idea for doing something like that, once the area is defined, would be to bring people together in something, could be, we'll call it a forum. Get everybody together, bring in the information from each of the IRWM regions. What other additional information is needed in that process we would bring in, and then coming out of that whole process would be a synthesis report. And obviously, DWR would have to team with stakeholders in the development of that. And from there, we go to the state level. So the next part of this concept is, you see off to the left part of your screen, those represent all the hydrologic area reports or whatever subdivisions we decide to do. Bring all that information together, plus perhaps some overlay areas like the mountain counties and the Delta area. Bring all that together, plus any other information that's pertinent, inter-hydrologic area information. There's aqueducts, that kind of thing, and then get everybody together, have a statewide summit, and then look at what rises to the top of the statewide level. So from there, the idea is to take that statewide synthesis that comes out of that process, combine it with state-level policy and plans that are informed by that statewide synthesis, and there you have your water plan. In concept, it seems pretty straightforward, but in practice, I can guarantee you it's going to be difficult, in my opinion, but very worthwhile. So our schedule, and I'll conclude so you guys can talk. We plan on finalizing the design of this Regional Water Management Atlas in early 2018, and by sometime in late 2018 or early 2019, we're going to initiate the forums and begin the process for the 2023 update. So thank you very much, and turn it over.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the panelists to introduce themselves. And I think we'll just start again 3 to 5 minutes at the most on your perspectives of how this will work, building the plan from the bottom up. And Lou, go ahead.
So I'm Lou Moeller from the Department of Water Resources. You've just heard from somebody from the department, so I'm going to keep my perspectives a little bit short, especially since he gave some really good groundwork on that from the Atlas. So I underscore the Atlas is the way we could go towards it. The one thing that I'm observing is that we've observed this a lot of times in the water plan, that implementation starts at a regional scale. And that's where, we see most efforts are taking place, and that's where the issues are really seen as well. So we have to recognize, and we need to reflect that in the water plan as well. And every time we've gone beyond trying to come from a state down or something like that, it hasn't worked as well. I would suggest also that in the water plan, that the draft that we are circulating around there's a few recommendations that I want to send people towards as well. The 5 themes that we've outlined, and it's on page 3-3, chapter 3, page 3, would be a good place to start as well. So I'm offering that up as a place to start. I think that's a good way to line. A lot of what I was hearing is what the state's role was from this morning's session. Dollars as incentives, alignment, and a holistic approach, including on data and governance, that setting limits might be some role that the state has, and I'm only picking the ones that I think that the California Water Plan may have some role to play in this as well. And then setting the proper scale for how we roll things up or how we look at things. There's a scale that is going to work. We can't get too down in the weeds. We also, you know, maybe the 10 hydrologic regions we're using is too high of a scale as well. And with that, I think I'm going to hand off next to Colin.
All right, hi everybody. I'm Colin Bailey with the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. For those unfamiliar with our work, we work with low resource environmental justice communities around the state. My personal involvement with the state water plan has been just over the last 2 updates from 2013 and now 2018. Yes, I'm a short timer. But within that time frame, I've seen a tremendous pendulum swing in terms of process for its development. I think I can characterize 2013 as it was really driven by specific constituency kind of caucus meetings, of which I participated in the Environmental Justice and Disadvantaged Community Caucus. There was another, I'm sure, for tribes and for several other constituencies. That produced what I think most will agree was a state water plan that had a tremendous volume of recommendations, but in some cases was almost unusable in its volume, and perhaps not as well organized as we might have otherwise made it usable. So here we are in 2018. I also serve now at the invitation of EWR on the Policy Advisory Committee with many in the room. And that process is the other end of that pendulum swing. It is a fairly small group of people who are largely at the tops of their respective organizations bringing forward their insights. And we have yet to have, and we'll have some conversation later today, those broader kind of grassroots conversations. And it remains to be seen what that ultimate product will be. So my comments just on process are going to draw from my organization's background as a hub organization that does community organizing and movement building. And there are some kind of pillars and principles that I think might be applicable here, some of which I have heard in Mike's presentation. Firstly, for our constituencies, you have to provide the necessary supports for engagement. And engagement doesn't happen without trust. It's a relationship development exercise. There's also a capacity building component, which we happily have now, I think, a real opportunity in the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program to leverage both the relationships and the trust that will be built from each, the ongoing conversation, and the capacity building as we raise everybody's watershed IQ, as it were, to really understand the bigger picture. Another principle of organizing that I think is pertinent here is that people organize around their own self-interest. And in order to understand what that is, you really have to have a relationship with folks. The third principle that relates to the 2 former is that it's easier to organize those who are already organized and where there are already relationships. So you do go to leaders, as we have done with the current Policy Advisory Committee, but you do want to make sure that they're bringing with them, by definition as leaders, they have followers, they have people who reach out to them, and where there is trust. So there are any number of groups, and many of them are represented here, where you can develop that, whether it's through the newly forming GSAs, through many of the groups, KUWA, AQUA, the Resource Conservation Districts, organizations like EJCW, like SIA, and of course the IRWM regions, which hopefully at the end of the involvement program will be more deeply integrated with disadvantaged communities and tribes. Another feature that as a newcomer to the state water plan I'll observe is it's good to have a real clear purpose and vision, and I'm open to suggestions as to what the ultimate value of the state water plan has been in the past and will be into the future. And we've had some discussion, of course, on what this new iteration of that will be. But our constituents really need to have that clear up front, as time is precious and choices have to be made. I'll just reiterate that among Mike's conversation, his structure for leveraging up from smaller to larger conversations in community organizing. We call that a fractal or a snowflake model, which I think is a good element of what's been presented. And that is the idea that you have a structure for a conversation at a very small level that then ratchets up to larger levels and actually has its corollary at ever larger scales. In our work, we do that both by geography. So you have local chapters that sometimes are at the community-based level, where you have someone who's responsible as a facilitator, coordinator, et cetera, leveraging those relationships, that then you have people who come together at a regional level, usually at the hydrologic level, sometimes at the IRWM level, and then ratcheted up to statewide with the addition of cross-cutter issue substantive workshops or substantive work groups. And we can talk about what those might be. I feel myself running long, so I'm going to pass it on here. Just 1 second. But I think it was Martha Davis who mentioned earlier the value of good facilitation, coordination, all the supports. Just cannot hammer that home enough, which in this context also means having someone who's culturally competent, and that can be any culture. It took me a long time to figure out how to talk to engineers, and I think I've got it sort of figured out. I've also learned to speak Central Valley in various ways. To Director Davis, I didn't get a chance to ask the question earlier, but we do need to get Anasita involved in deeper and broader ways. So let's find out how to get her more support. And I'll pass it there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, my name is Dana Frioff. I am an engineer, registered civil engineer. Yeah. I think before I get into our perspective, I just want to touch a little bit on the San Diego IRWM and give you a little bit about the governance in our region, because that really plays into our perspective on this issue. We have a regional water management group that consists of the city of San Diego and the county and the water authority. We also formed a regional advisory committee, which is really critical to the success of our program. We've got 36 individual stakeholders, very diverse group. We've got, disadvantaged communities represented, along with tribal representation, along with NGOs and the Building Industry Association, for example, and water agencies. So it's really been key to our success. And then we also have, in regards to governance in our funding area, we've been fortunate to really collaborate well within our funding area with both the Upper Santa Margarita area and also South Orange County. And so we've come together and we have a agreement for allocation of the IRWM funds that do come to our funding area. So we've been very successful in that too. So I think we've been really fortunate to have a solid governance structure in San Diego County. I think that's why we've been so successful in our effort. I think we've secured over $96 million in funding for the region. Now, in regards to the region itself, good and bad, we are not like the Santa Ana watershed, where we don't have just one nice, simple watershed. We actually have 11 hydrologic units. Well, I guess maybe simple is not, it can be complex, I'm sorry. But we have 11 hydrologic units, 11 watersheds. And so when we talk about, this big picture of planning by watershed, that really does not make sense for San Diego County. We really need to, I think for us, the IRWM region makes more sense. It does take into account the jurisdictional boundaries that we do have. So from our perspective, while our IRWM plan is watershed-based approach, it does show, what's happening in each of those watersheds, which is great for water quality in regards to environmental issues also. But from the big water supply perspective, I think for us, the IRWM planning region makes sense. And then I want to say, in regards to our supply portfolio, again, this plays into our perspective, is that, we unfortunately are still reliant, majority of our supplies are imported water. We've diversified tremendously over the years since the early 90s, but we still rely on a lot of imported water. We don't have a lot of groundwater. So again, back to that watershed issue, we don't really have a massive groundwater basin that we can manage. And so that's, again, why we look more at the IRWM region. Now, and I want to say right off that we fully support DARE's effort to try to do this from the bottom up. I think this is the approach we need to take. Some of the questions, though, that we've been asking ourselves in this in this approach. The first one, I think it's been addressed here, is at what level should the information be collected? Should it be at the hydrologic region, the funding area region, or the planning area region? And I think Mr. Davis mentioned that maybe the hydrologic region isn't appropriate. And I think we would agree with that. I went back and looked at the 2013 plan and looked at the hydrologic regional report. And it didn't really touch on the specific issues to our area. There was a lot of discussion on groundwater, which makes sense considering you're looking at the whole hydrologic region. But for us, it just didn't touch on our issues. So I think at a minimum, we need to go down to the funding areas, if not the planning areas themselves. I mean, I could envision where, you know, even though there's some 48 planning areas, where we could have just a short synopsis of the issues and then have a link to the IRWM plan if you need more of that information on the population and all these other issues or all the other, you know, statistics and such. Because that way I think you'll really tap into what the true issues are within all the regions. And then again, you can build upon that though and you know, have an overall, take the similarities between those planning areas and then have a kind of synopsis of what looks statewide. So that's the first question, is what size? And then the second, though, is how do we balance the need for consistency, so consistency between the plans so that we can have some consistent information, and the fact that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to the IRWM regions. Because what we may highlight as important in our region, how we present that could be very different from what they do on the North Coast, for example. And so that's something that we're going to have to talk about, and perhaps, you know, getting down to the more granular level is something we may need to do. I think those are the main points that I wanted to make on this approach. I guess I'll turn it over to Lynne now.
Thank you. So Lynne Rodriguez, Watersheds Coalition of Ventura County, and I'll just very briefly talk about Ventura County for those of you that aren't familiar with Southern California County, about 860,000 people. A microcosm, I think, of almost all the regions in California, that we have agriculture, we have mountain areas, we have some high desert, we have different microclimates, we have groundwater, surface water, imported water. We're doing a lot of the mix of projects that are happening elsewhere in the state. So we have coastal areas, we have seawater intrusion. So we're kind of dealing with a mix of everything in our area. I've been involved in, just since the end of the process of 2005 water plan update, not that I was on the committees or anything, but just that I tracked it. And I want to give an example of, we're talking about bottom up here, but when I came on board to develop the IRWM plan for Ventura County in 2005, I was looking sort of top down in a lot of ways. I took the water plan update that had just was freshly minted and other documents at the state level, and felt like that was a good starting point to raise the water IQ, as you say, Colin, of our folks in our region, because people do get a little insular with kind of what the issues are in their own area. And I thought it was good to bring that in and share with folks in our county the good work that the state had done. We have a bottom-up approach in our IRWM region. We have 3 major watersheds and some smaller coastal watersheds, but the 3 major watersheds are our planning unit, really, for our IRWM effort. And as you very well pointed out, Colin, the fact that people are much more going to gravitate towards what matters to them. And geographically speaking, it's easier to get people to care about what's happening in their watershed than it is to even get them to care about what's happening countywide, let alone hydrologic region or state. So I would argue, to the question of scale, I think you can't go too big. And I would think even the funding area, we're in the LA Ventura funding area. So we're next to LA County. Well, LA County is a completely different animal. I mean, we share some common interests and certainly watershed boundaries, but it would be really hard for us. I think we're struggling a little bit with the disadvantaged community involvement process to make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs when they're so vastly different between one very urban area and one more rural, agricultural, small community area. So, and I've heard from folks when we have discussions with the Roundtable of Regions about scale when it comes to, we were talking about Proposition 1 recently, and can we get agreement within funding areas on issues? What are our greatest needs as a funding area and whatnot? And some of the people in the room say, we can't get everybody in our IRWM region to agree on, you know, so I think the smaller you make it and the more people can relate to the issues that are being addressed, I would say, you know, watershed scale may not be right because the variation in watersheds is so vast between the little ones in San Diego County and, you know, the huge ones, you know, in SAPA and some of the other areas. So I don't know that I have an answer to that question, but I do very much support sort of the bottom-up approach. And as we develop our groundwater sustainability agencies and plans, which all of us, most of us are, you know, engaged in that in some way or another in the IRWM regions, and we have 7, I believe we have 7 GSAs, which I guess isn't very many compared to some areas, but that's another sort of fundamental block of planning that's happening, and that's taking the IRWM regional scale that we had pretty successfully been implementing, and it's breaking people into these little groups, and they're kind of going to their corners. And so it's creating the need for us to sort of pull that back together and pull it together so that we're working together and not at cross purposes, or because the resources aren't good enough to spread across developing a GSP at the same time you're working on an implementation of IRWM. So I think we just have to be mindful of the scale, and I don't know that there is a one-size-fits-all right answer to the question, but you know, we've been working very hard in Ventura County to sort of keep these things together and keep people at the table and engaged, and the smaller the scale, the easier it is to do that, I guess, is my point. And I want to also reiterate what everybody's saying about the trust and the relationships, and it is much easier when you develop that trust and that relationship. You want to keep it going and you want to build on it. And so bringing it back to how do we use the bottom-up approach for developing the water plan, I think we can get people excited. You know, in 2013, there were these regional groups, design teams, I guess, and the development of the region reports, which I don't think I will take ownership that we didn't work hard enough to get people in our area to like care about that. And we tried to get them to the table, and we've developed the, you know, the region reports were written, and that process was difficult because there wasn't consistency. Some regions had more information than others. There wasn't a single process used to roll that information in. And the South Coast Regional Report did not end up being a useful tool for us at our area. So I don't want to be critical because I know it's really hard to develop that. But if it's going to be a roll-up and it's going to be something that the people at the local level really want to use, then it's a lot of work because you have to keep them engaged, and you have to say, this is where you're going to find yourself in this state document. And the state Department of Water Resources and other state board, other entities care about what's in there, and they're actually going to look to you as the expert. And I think that helps people feel more engaged and more empowered in the process.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Brad Sherwood with the Sonoma County Water Agency, former home of Grant Davis. We love you, Grant. So now that we know that DWR stands for doing what's right, there are several things that I think are going right in the right direction in terms of engaging locals for this bottom-up approach, which we wholeheartedly support. Sonoma County Water Agency, of course, we're involved in the North Coast and Bay Area IRWMs. So we're in 2 different regional plans, 2 different stakeholder groups, really worlds apart in terms of needs and assessments and projects. And when it comes to interagency or inter-regional collaboration, that's tough. My colleague, Ann Dubay, who's here, helps manage the North Coast Integrated Plan. I myself help manage some of the Bay Area plan with Carl Morrison, who in many ways acts as our coordinator, as was described earlier in the day, the need for coordinators. You're going to talk about North Coast in a few minutes. So, yes, coordinators are needed. Why? To keep everyone together, to provide input and collaboration. Carl's our go-to guy in the Bay Area who works with stakeholders, who keeps all the various groups together working in one forward-moving path. Now, saying that, we couldn't do our job without DWR's regional programs. Gary Lipner, the regional team, fantastic. As much as DWR can support funding and staffing for that regional program, that regional staffing, critical. Who else is going to do that work? Boots on the ground. That's what's needed. Now, the 58 county initiative, which Director Davis just described, vitally important. interested to hear how that's going to roll out, because it's at the county regional level where really we're putting the meat on the bone. The water plan is the bone. It's the local agencies, the local regional plans. That's the meat. So the question I have is, how do we ensure that meat gets on the bone, stays on the bone, and we all get a bite of it? and speaking of taking a piece of meat off the bone, integrated regional water management. Where is it in the water code? We need to support IRWM. How do we do that? Fundamental. Our East Coast office, i.e. Lisa Renton, who many of you know through the Water Bond Coalition, has these words of advice. Establish baseline funding for IRWM. Language to the California Water Code. Recognize IRWM as a key means of increasing self-reliance. State agencies align policies, programs, and regulations with IRWM. And that includes the water plan update. So in a nutshell, yes, we're totally supportive, working with DACs, working with DWR staff, realizing that we locals hold the necessary details and information to make the plan successful. And we can do that as long as DWR is supportive of our initiatives and our thoughts. And they have been, and they've shown that, and we've been very lucky through pilot study, which we're going to be going through here in the Russian River. Charles Gardner running that study for us, the pilot study. We can show actual metrics, schedules, illustrate how we're working in our watershed. While it may be a small model, it can be replicated on a regional funding level process. So that's stakeholder involvement, that's a detailing gap analysis of funding and project requirements, all which could be rolled up into a larger funding programmatic level scheme for the water plan. So we are a microcosm of the state, as Grant pointed out, in the Russian River watershed, and we're happy and proud to have been chosen for this pilot study and look forward to implementing it with our partners and sharing that knowledge with the rest of our community. But first and foremost, we have to continue to support the DWR regional planning efforts. And that's Gary and his team and all the other offices, because they are our go-to folks, I believe, along with Arts Group and the IRWM group, to keep this going. All right, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sherry Norris. I'm with the California Indian Environmental Alliance. We work on IRWMs, and specifically we're the Tribal Engagement Coordinator for the North Coast, so those 34 tribes we're beholden to. We are very lucky to have a governance structure that includes the tribes, and it's not just by luck, it's by their efforts and those that were involved in the IRWM when they first came in. And I wasn't there during that time. I was brought in afterwards, so I can't take credit for that hard work of getting them involved. But what I can say is that the way that the structure is set up is I have bosses, and my bosses are the tribal representatives that were voted in by the 34 tribes. There are 6 representatives, and then they have their alternate individuals. So there could be as many as 12 tribes represented of the 34 in that governance structure. Prior to when the Regional Water Management Group meets, the day prior, the tribes caucus. So we actually facilitate a tribal-only meeting so that those tribal representatives can hear from the tribes in the area. And we're really excited about the DAX program because we're looking to that support in order to increase the participation of all of the tribes in that area in guiding those the decisions made by those representatives. And then they in turn tell me what to do, and that's what I do. So I would say that in this process that we're discussing about including IRWMs in the water plan, yes, absolutely, that's a wonderful idea. There's so much work done at the local level, and there's so much trust that's been built in the North Coast between tribes and the counties and all of the agencies that are there, that more in the North Coast than I've seen in other regions of the state. And just by the ability of, when you have to sit down and roll up your sleeves and choose which projects are going to be funded, you really get to know people. So they've really, and there's some relationships that started off as uncomfortable, and I've seen some friendships be built out of that. And so I'm really I'm in support of IRWM continuing and also helping to guide water management in the state and to help to support this plan development. What I also wanted to say that's important is tribes in the North Coast have included their goals in the goals of the IRWM plan. So the participation of tribes in this type of an effort is only as good as the ability for that IRWM group to actually include tribes in the development of their plan and the inclusion in their governance structure. So I'm working in 4 IRWM regions for the DAC program, the Disadvantaged Community Program. In the North Coast, we're calling it DACT, recognizing that disadvantaged communities and tribal communities it's more of a Venn diagram than a the same. So we're as in doing that, one of my hopes is that in the Mountain Counties area, the Sac River area, and the Bay Area, that we're able to have the space for tribes to come up with their own governance structure to then be part of the larger regional water management group structures. Now, the other piece to it to think about, and many of you already know this, is tribes are governments. So that's the other reason for that stakeholder engagement, DAC, and including the word tribes as being separate. And each of those tribes have a responsibility to their constituency that votes them in. So to involve community when it comes to tribes, you're actually involving tribal governments who are then reaching out to their communities, which is most respectful of sovereignty, because you wouldn't, for example, have England go into France and talk to their people about what they want. So it's like, if you think about that, really, it comes down to that kind of a piece. Timing is extremely going to be important in this. We've struggled over the years with tribal engagement and tribal inclusion in any of the state policies or procedures or activities of making sure that the tribal piece happens at the right time, meaning that if the tribal piece happens afterwards, then they're trying to get their information added in. If it happens too early, then tribes don't have an opportunity to weigh in on some of the new decisions that have come up after their engagement. So we've been saying, when it comes to the word consultation, which is another topic, but consultation is supposed to be early and often, which means during the planning phase, throughout the phase, and at the end for the review, because you don't know what's going to happen in between. I mean, you can start off one direction and then it veers off another way, and if the tribes aren't engaged to see that change, it won't happen. See what else could maybe help our process conversations. The other thing to think about is, as we're talking about climate change and we're looking at these forward-thinking plans and we're looking for ways to handle issues of drought or flooding, that some of these older structures that tribes actually had in place before first contact even, they're not here. And when we think about the way that a tsunami might hit our coast, or when we think of the way that a flooding event comes down from the mountains, or why the snowpack isn't there anymore, and now what are we going to do about it? There's some old systems when you talk to tribal communities, so that's why TEK is so important, traditional ecological knowledge. Because if you have in the coast, I'm going to start out there, if you have kelp beds that are in place, and you have wetlands that are in place, and something hits the shore, it's a lot less impactful. The same for what we saw in Oroville, is if we had upland meadows that had beavers, which were one of the first things that was missing in contact, if we had beavers there, they dig down and they create these wide spaces of wetland and these deep crevices of places where water is, and it's cool and it creates habitat for the fish, but it also makes it take a lot longer for that water to hit a reservoir or a dam. So there's a lot of things that when we talk about whether we're going to do this on a watershed level, a local level, a hydraulic level, tribes always want to get to this watershed approaches, and there are multiple tribes along that watershed region that really haven't had an opportunity to talk or on a watershed approach, just like we as counties, agencies, et cetera, haven't had a chance to have those complete headwaters to ocean conversations, and tribes are just wanting that so badly. So I could see that being really, really useful. Let's see what else I'm missing here. I made a whole bunch of notes. TK, I think I hit a lot of it. So yeah, thank you very much. Hope that helps.
That one on too? So we have time, and we intentionally have time to have some interactive discussion with the audience, but I was wondering if there's any panelists that had something that they wanted to add before we open it up to the floor. Nope. Okay, then let's go ahead and open it to the floor. Excellent.
I keep looking around because I'm seeing if Mike Mead is still here. You in the room, Mike? I'm going to reference work that the Water Foundation was doing, and I was part of. They worked first in Sonoma, and then they did some work within Inland Empire Utilities Agency on assessing. It was a development of a sustainable water management profile tool, a way of assessing the sustainable management of water. And an innovation in that system, and there's a lot of depth to it that I'm skipping, but an innovation in there was to think about first the stresses that a particular region was facing, and then the management response to those stresses, and they were measuring both things. And I'm wondering if part of our problem about figuring out the right scale here is that we're actually trying to do two things that are actually at different scales. So the questions of water management is at a governance scale, like who's in charge of what, where, but then it's also an environmental, biological, physical scale of watershed. Where is the water? Where is the land? And I'm wondering if there's room going forward, if this rings true to anyone else on the panel, and if there's room for us to maybe think in this direction, that the state could be really powerful at saying, here's the physical conditions of the state related to water, because that is relatively scale, not a management scale question. That's a physical scale question. And then all the regions would be responsible for talking about the management scales that they're responsible for and how it's responding to that physical condition. I think it might be a really interesting way to move forward. And again, I'm borrowing heavily from what Water Foundation was doing.
I think that's a good idea, but anybody else want to weigh in?
That actually makes me think of when I was saying there's something else, and that reminds me of that. It's that interregional support for tribes. Tribes are often in multiple IRWMs. So, you know, the boundaries of a tribal area, and then you have all of the other jurisdictional boundaries that we have that go over the top, and the hydrological boundaries. So as we go through this or any other process to think about that interregional support, I know one tribe specifically that's in 4 IRWMs, one tribal environmental director trying to navigate that. And so any kind of interregional funding or support for that kind of a conversation, they would need to be involved in multiple hydrologic regions conversations in addition to just the IRWM regions beneath them or within them.
Totally disagree. I was just waiting to get Grant's reaction with that one. Obviously, concur. And, you know, as a wholesaler, we've got a huge multi-watershed approach, you know, stemming from Lake County all the way down to San Francisco Bay. So would be supportive of that. And obviously, you know, we've done a lot with the Water Education Foundation, with the pilot study that we're doing now that would support that kind of method.
I like the idea, and I just wanted to say that I think it's good if the water plan can, and maybe it has in the past, but reflect those things, and you can talk about different things. You can talk about hydrologic scale. You could talk about, you know, the really local level. I mean, the scale of disadvantaged community outreach or other things. I mean, it might vary across all kinds of things. And to the extent that that can be reflected and portrayed, you know, to the satisfaction of the local areas that it's describing, I think that really makes a lot of sense, because it really isn't one size fits all from one thing to another. So I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah, I'm not sure it quite gets to your issue or what you brought up, but I could see, for example, though at the hydrologic region, there are some areas of commonality, and maybe we do capture that in the water plan. And then, for example, in the South Coast region, the majority of us purchase water from the Metropolitan Water District. So, you know, there could be some areas of commonality, but yeah, I still think we need to get down to the, you know, the communities and the planning areas to really dive into the issues.
Thank you. I was going to say almost exactly that for a similar reason, I suspect. And I was thinking of, I can't remember her name, but there's a nun in Catalonia who's been advocating for the dissolution of Spain because she says that democracy only works on a very small scale. And so we did I'll come back to that. We as EJCW and UC Davis had a convening just last week with small water systems from around the state. And this issue came up because those systems are, I think, uniquely lost in that disconnect between the scale of the problem and the scale of the governance and the capacity gap that is left therein. But at the same time, just to echo those comments, we would want to make sure that that grassroots process still scaled up, because the more attenuated the representative nature of that discussion becomes, the more likely our constituencies are to be no longer there. And I think that's an important role for DWR staff to anchor, who often take a very neutral, objective position on their facilitator role, but in the absence of particular voices can still play a significant role in anchoring interests that might not be well represented.
I just have to say, it's going to make sure you read Colin's biography. We'll see if there's a request. Do we have anything else on it?
Yeah, thanks a lot for all of your reflections on this. And I had kind of a governance question that we're all trying to figure out. Each of you represent what amounts to a county-based system that has watersheds within it. And this is actually a question for DWR. Of all the IRWMs, if you put them into two buckets, one of them being pretty much a county-based system, or those that are multi-county, how have the multi-county systems operated? Have you found them to be as effective, less effective, more effective? Partly because as institutions, we all work within the governance apparatus that we have. And so I'm trying to figure out in the multi-county places if that's the case.
You know, it really depends on the counties. There's areas, North Coast Resource Partnership is a good example, where you've got some very affluent county in terms of resource ability, and then there's some that aren't, but they work together. And to be honest, Sonoma County carries a lot of the weight for others, which is very altruistic of them in many respects, but they see the value in keeping that group. Some places it's to each their own. In the Central Valley, there's still a ways to go in many areas in terms of getting counties to even participate, really. So there's no real simple answer to those two buckets, I'm afraid, at least as far as we've seen.
The only thing I wanted to say about that, speaking as a county-based IRWM, is that the advantage to us being the size that we are contained in the county boundary is that for land use planning purposes, we have great interconnect, because actually the program that I work on, I am housed at the county CEO's office, and the planning department and all the county agencies are sort of under the CEO's office. So not that we can direct them to do things, but as they're doing the general plan update right now, they're adding a water element, and we're working really closely together with them on developing that. So from the standpoint, which GSAs also require this, but that communication between land use planning, which is so important in the more urban, we're sort of semi-urban, I guess, small urban, that piece has been a real benefit for us. And I think it would be hard if we were linked with other counties where you would have a harder time doing that.
So being in 4 IRWM regions, right, and very fresh. I worked in the Upper Feather River IRWM region in the Mountain Counties funding area. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the disadvantaged community program changes the relationship between those that are in funding areas, because I'm sitting at the table now with the heads of multiple IRWMs talking about how this disadvantaged communities program is going to roll out. And so not to put us all on the hot seat, those of us that are like in the SAC or the Mountain Counties area that are that were funding area-based DAX programs where we're in IRWMs within them, I'm looking forward to seeing how things shift. So we'll see.
If I can just add to the multi-county effort, I think that for the dollars, you get more bang for the buck, perhaps, if you have a multi-county regional project. For example, the Bay Area, 9 counties, $19 million grant coming in from DWR to support installing 5 new radar units that are not just going to support the 9 counties, but quite frankly, the Sierras and Eastern Slope, which helps other regions as well. I mean, I think if we can really think regional here, think about the average taxpayer, how they want to stretch their dollar, and they want more resources for less. And I think that if you have additional multi-county efforts, you can stretch those dollars more, and you can have more benefit for the resource. We're leveraging we're getting 19 million from the state, and we're leveraging how many millions from locals out of those individual counties. That's a huge investment. And that's truly an integrated regional project. And it's actually the first one, probably the largest one, in the Bay Area. And I think that speaks volumes when you go to the voters and you ask them to pass another bond for this type of funding. So I would say we all should strive as much as we can to have those multi-county efforts.
How are we on time? 4 minutes. So Lou's going to do a quick wrap up. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists very much, and thank you to the DWR staff. A couple, I wrote down a lot of bullet points, but one of the things I really heard was trust and relationships, and that's I guess, it never hurts to get reminded of how important that is over and over and over again, because really you can't do anything if you can't sit down at a table with someone. Making things meaningful for whoever it is that is participating, because it's meaningful to me does not mean it's meaningful to anybody else. So how do we really make these efforts meaningful so people want to participate? And then lastly, of course, another common theme, not one size fits all. So that'll be a challenge as we move forward, and maybe it does need to be different sizes at different places for different reasons. So Lou, do you want to wrap up with what you're going to do with all this?
Yeah, we're going to take it all in and we'll come out with a report, right? Isn't that it? Less than 100 pages. No, I think that a lot of things were touched on. One is the pilot studies that we're doing here as well. That's something that is going to really inform us a lot on the ground and how this might work as well. I think we are talking about the process for the next water plan, but right now we are dealing with the Atlas design as well, and that's something that we're going to be working, and the schedule's still up there right now. So early in this, we're kind of focused on the water plan, 100-page document right now. So we're saying early 2018 we'll get on that. But we'll, as soon as we have capacity, we'll try to get on this Atlas design as well. But a lot of these concepts, are definitely going to have to fold in. And there are some parts, and in my opening, I did say that there are parts in the water plan right now that we can influence. So there's recommendations in Chapter 3. I encourage everybody to look at Chapter 3 and give us feedback on that along these lines so that we can actually incorporate it into 2018 and not just leave this to 2023. I think that's about it that I can think of. Thanks.